A few weeks prior, I found myself at the beach with my son, an experience that took an unexpected turn, ultimately becoming one of the most thrilling days of my life. I remain uncertain if that is entirely acceptable. The beach has always served as my sanctuary, a space for reflection, contemplation, and, more recently, a means of escape. On that particular day, I had brought along Leo, my 18-year-old son, who, despite his youth, possessed a tall stature and the quiet confidence typical of someone much older. The decision to visit the beach was made on a whim. My wife, Susan, was once again engrossed in her work, leaving Leo and me to devise our own plans. Typically, our outings consisted of quiet evenings at home or the occasional excursion, but that morning, as sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, I resolved that we needed a change of scenery. The drive to the beach was uneventful. Leo sat beside me in the car, one earbud in place as he scrolled through his phone, occasionally glancing out at the rolling dunes and wild grasses lining the road. I attempted to initiate conversation several times, inquiring about school or his recent soccer match, but his replies were brief and courteous, as if he were uncertain about my sudden urge to engage. Upon our arrival, Leo assisted in carrying the cooler and beach bag to a spot near the water's edge, where the sand felt cool and damp beneath our feet. The beach was nearly deserted, which suited me perfectly. A few families were scattered along the shore, their laughter carried by the breeze, yet there was sufficient distance between us to create a sense of solitude. I spread out our towels while Leo secured the umbrella in the sand. The midday sun was already intense, its rays beating down relentlessly, and I appreciated the small patch of shade as I settled on the edge of my towel, removing my sandals and allowing my toes to sink into the sand. I glanced over at Leo, who had taken a seat under the umbrella, once again engrossed in his phone. I couldn't help but ask, "Are you really going to spend the entire day staring at that device?" Prompt: rewrite differently this text. Version 1. I gently teased Leo as I motioned toward his phone. He looked up, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Just checking something," he said. "I'm here, aren't I?" I couldn't argue with that. He had come without complaint, and for a teenager, that was saying something. Still, I wanted him to enjoy the moment, to feel the sun on his face, the salt air in his lungs, the freedom of being away from everything for just a little while. "Help me with the sunscreen," I asked, holding up the bottle. Leo raised an eyebrow. "Can't you do it yourself?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Not my back, obviously." He sighed but stood up, brushing the sand off his shorts, and took the bottle from my hand. He squeezed some into his palm, the faint smell of coconut filling the air. I lay face down on the towel, resting my chin on my folded arms as I waited. The first touch of his hands on my shoulders was light, almost tentative, as though he was afraid of hurting me. "You can press harder," I said, my voice muffled by my arms. "I'm not that fragile." His touch grew firmer, more confident, as he worked the lotion into my skin. The sun beat down on us, its heat tempered by the coolness of his hands. For a moment, I let myself relax, focusing on the rhythm of his movements and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore. "You've gotten good at this," I joked lightly, trying to ease the silence. Leo chuckled softly. "Yeah, sure, my secret talent, professional sunscreen applier." But then, as his hands moved lower, I noticed something, a hesitation, a pause that lingered just a beat too long. His fingers brushed against the curve of my back, just above where my swim shorts started, and my breath caught in my throat. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment, but I couldn't ignore the way my body tensed or the way his hands lingered a second too long. "It's okay," I said softly, trying to keep my voice steady. "You can." There was an unmistakable shift in the atmosphere, though Leo remained silent. His hands continued their movement, descending with a caution that quickened my heartbeat. I squeezed my eyes shut, urging myself to relax and breathe deeply. However, my mind raced ahead, each thought more perplexing than the last. "Thanks, sweetheart," I murmured when he finally paused, hoping my tone would alleviate the tension that had enveloped us. He quickly stepped back, wiping his hands on his shorts. "No problem," he replied, his voice softer than before. I turned onto my side, propping myself up on one elbow to observe him. His gaze was directed toward the water, but I noticed the faint flush on his cheeks and the way his jaw tightened, as if he were struggling to maintain composure. "Are you okay?" I inquired gently. He nodded, yet he avoided making eye contact. The silence between us felt heavy and charged until I finally sat up and reached for the cooler. "Let's grab something to eat," I suggested cheerfully, attempting to lighten the mood. Leo nodded again, finally turning to face me. His expression was inscrutable, but there was a flicker of emotion in his eyes that I could not quite identify. Just like that, the moment slipped away, but the tension lingered, and I sensed that this was far from over. We sat on our towels with the cooler between us. I handed him a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, watching as he devoured it without much thought. The sun continued its ascent in the sky, casting a warm glow over the beach, and for a brief moment, everything felt normal again. "You've been quiet," I remarked, breaking the silence as I took a sip from my water bottle. Leo shrugged, avoiding my gaze. "Just tired, I guess." "Tired?" I teased. "You slept until 10 this morning." He offered a half smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "Yeah, well, I suppose the sun makes you feel a bit lazy." I nodded, allowing the conversation to settle. It was unusual for Leo to be so withdrawn, and I wondered if he was still preoccupied with earlier events. Perhaps I was projecting my own concerns onto him. I found myself replaying the moment in my mind, the way his hands had faltered, the shift in the air surrounding us. I dismissed the thought, redirecting my attention to the sound of the waves and the joyful laughter of children playing in the shallows nearby. "Would you like to take a walk?" I inquired, gesturing toward the water's edge where the surf gently caressed the sand. Leo hesitated for a moment before nodding in agreement. We rose and brushed the sand from our legs, leaving our towels and cooler behind. The tide was beginning to come in, and the cool water felt refreshing against my feet as we strolled along the beach. I stole a glance at Leo as we walked. He had his hands buried in the pockets of his swim shorts, his head slightly bowed as if he were deep in thought. "What's on your mind?" I asked, maintaining a light tone. He shrugged, replying, "Nothing much, just thinking." He paused, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know, life, I guess." I smiled gently, "That's quite a broad topic." Leo stopped walking and turned to face me, the wind tousling his hair, making him appear older than his 16 years. "Do you ever feel like you don't really know who you are anymore?" The question took me by surprise, but I could see the earnestness in his eyes. "All the time," I admitted, my voice softening. "Why do you ask?" He looked down at the sand, tracing aimless patterns in the wet grains. "I don't know. I guess I've just been feeling different lately, like I don't belong anywhere." My heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. I reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "That's completely normal, Leo, especially at your age. It's okay to feel that way." He looked up at me, his brown eyes searching mine. "Do you really think so?" "I do," I replied firmly. "And it won't last forever. You'll figure it out. You're an incredible young man, Leo, you will find your place." For a moment, we stood in silence, the sound of the waves filling the space between us. Then he smiled, a small, tentative curve of his lips, but it was enough to lighten my heart. "Grateful for the lighter mood," Dad remarked quietly as we continued our stroll, shifting our discussion to more cheerful subjects. I recounted the summers the first had spent at the beach during his age, sharing memories of racing with friends to gather seashells and spending countless hours constructing intricate sandcastles. He chuckled as I recounted a particularly unfortunate incident where I attempted to dig a tunnel beneath a sand dune, only for it to collapse midway. "You were such a dork," he said with a grin. "I still am," I replied, playfully nudging him. "You just haven't realized it yet." We arrived at a cluster of rocks at the beach's far end, where the waves crashed against them, sending sprays of foam into the air. I climbed onto one of the larger rocks, extending my hand for balance as I settled at the top. Leo followed, his longer legs allowing him to navigate the uneven terrain with ease. From our elevated position, the view was stunning. The ocean stretched out before us, vast and infinite, with sunlight sparkling on its surface like a sea of diamonds. "This is nice," Leo remarked, his voice now softer. I nodded, drawing my knees to my chest. "It is." We sat in silence for a while, simply observing the waves and allowing the breeze to disperse the burdens of our thoughts. A sense of tranquility enveloped me, a feeling I had not experienced in quite some time, as if the ocean was washing away the tension and uncertainty that had accumulated within me. "Dad," Leo's voice interrupted the stillness. "Yeah?" I responded, noticing his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Do you ever feel like you're missing something? Like there's a part of your life that's just absent?" I turned to him, taken aback by his question. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he replied, his brow furrowing. "Sometimes it feels like there's more out there, you know? Like I'm stuck, and I don't know how to get unstuck." I reached out, placing a gentle yet firm hand on his arm. "Leo, you're not stuck. You're just in the process of figuring things out, and that takes time. It's perfectly okay to feel this way, it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong." He looked at me, his eyes reflecting a depth of emotion. The emotion I struggled to articulate was acknowledged by him in a soft voice as we sat on the rocks. The sun began its gradual descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The world around us seemed to pause, as if it were holding its breath, and for the first time in a long while, I sensed that perhaps everything would be all right, though I remained unaware of what lay ahead. As the sun sank lower, it cast a golden light over the beach while Leo and I descended from the rocks, making our way back to our towels. The tide was rising, and the water gently lapped at the sand, occasionally brushing against our feet. Upon reaching our spot, Leo took a bottle of water and drank deeply. I reclined on the towel, propping myself on my elbows, allowing the cool breeze to envelop me. "Feeling better?" I inquired, glancing at him. He nodded, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Yeah, I think so. The walk helped." "Good," I replied with a gentle smile. "You've been carrying a lot lately. It's essential to take moments like this to simply breathe." He settled beside me, his long legs extended in front of him. For a time, we remained silent, the rhythmic sound of the waves providing a soothing backdrop. I sensed the tension in my shoulders dissipating, yet an unspoken current lingered between us, akin to a charged wire humming just beneath the surface. As the breeze intensified, I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly aware of the coolness in the air. Leo noticed and reached for the thin blanket we had brought, draping it over my shoulders without uttering a word. His hands brushed against my arm, and I felt a warmth that transcended the blanket. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice softer than I had intended. Leo settled back down, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course," I replied, turning to face him. He hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. "Do you ever feel like you're not enough?" A question struck me unexpectedly, much like a powerful wave. It was sudden and all-consuming. I opened my mouth to reply, but the words became lodged in my throat. He continued, "You are always doing everything for everyone, Dad, Emma, me, but who takes care of you?" I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words settle heavily in my chest. "That is a complex question," I replied cautiously. Leo turned to face me, his brown eyes earnest and probing. "You don't have to answer if you don't wish to. I've just noticed how hard you work, and I don't think anyone appreciates it enough." Emotion surged within me, and I had to blink back the sudden onset of tears. "Thank you, Leo," I said softly, his words meant more to me than he could know. He reached out, placing his hand over mine. It was a simple gesture, yet the warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me. I glanced down at our hands, my heart racing, and for a brief moment, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. "Dad," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "you deserve to feel acknowledged." I met his gaze, and the intensity in his eyes made it impossible to look away. My breath caught, and for a moment, I felt as though I were standing on the edge of a precipice, balancing between what was right and what I desired. "Leo," I began, my voice quivering, but he shook his head. "I know this is strange," he said quickly. "I understand it may not make sense, but I just want you to know how much I care about you." I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "I care about you too, Leo, more than you realize." His hand tightened around mine, and I felt the weight of his emotions in the silence that enveloped us. The sun continued its descent, casting long shadows across the beach as day transitioned into dusk. "Can we stay a little longer?" he asked softly. I nodded, unable to articulate anything further. We remained there as the sky transformed into hues of orange and pink, the air around us growing cooler. The blanket wrapped around my shoulders felt heavier now, as if it were holding more than just the chill at bay. Leo shifted closer, his shoulder brushing against mine. A peculiar blend of comfort and unease enveloped me as I sat beside him. I reassured myself that it was merely a father and son enjoying a tranquil moment on the beach, yet deep within, I sensed there was something more significant at play. When he finally broke the silence, his voice was scarcely audible above the crashing waves. "I'm glad we came here today," he said. "Me too," I replied, my voice matching the quietness of the fading sunlight. A feeling of inevitability washed over me, akin to the tide's advance. I was uncertain of where this moment would lead, but I could not ignore the magnetic pull I experienced, the way my heart raced under his gaze and how his touch lingered just a fraction too long. The night was still young, and I understood that whatever unfolded next would alter everything. As twilight draped the beach in deep purples and soft oranges, the rhythmic sound of waves harmonized with the distant calls of seabirds. The world around us seemed to shrink, leaving just the two of us enveloped in the waning warmth of the sun and the palpable tension that lingered between us. Leo reclined, propping himself on his elbow. His expression was serene, yet his eyes darted toward me intermittently, as if probing the waters of an unspoken dialogue. I could feel the intensity of his gaze even when I averted my eyes. I adjusted the blanket around my shoulders, more out of restlessness than necessity. "It's getting late," I remarked softly, though I made no effort to gather our things. "Yeah," he replied, his voice low, "but it's nice here." Quiet. The word lingered in the air, reflecting the stillness that enveloped us. I glanced at him, noticing how the dim light softened the contours of his face, rendering him older and more contemplative. "Dad," he said suddenly, sitting up straight, "can I tell you something?" His tone surprised me, prompting me to turn fully toward him. "Of course," I responded, striving to maintain a steady voice. "You can tell me anything." He hesitated, his fingers gripping the edge of the towel beneath him. "It's just, I don't know how to say it." I tilted my head, feeling my heart begin to race. "You don't have to be afraid, just express what you're thinking," he said, exhaling sharply as he ran a hand through his hair. "I've been feeling differently lately about things, about you." The impact of his words struck me like a wave, leaving me breathless. My initial reaction was to laugh it off, to dismiss whatever he was attempting to convey, but the seriousness etched on his face halted me. "Leo," I said cautiously, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" He looked down at his hands, his shoulders tense. "I don't know, it's like when I see you, I can't explain it. It's not how I'm supposed to feel, but I can't help it." I stared at him, my mind racing. A part of me wanted to reject this notion, to tell him he was mistaken, that it was merely a phase or a fleeting moment of confusion. Yet, another part of me, the part that had sensed the same inexplicable pull throughout the day, could not voice those thoughts. Instead, I reached out, placing my hand gently on his arm. "Leo," I began, my voice trembling, "this is complicated." He nodded, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "I know it is, and I understand it's wrong, but it doesn't feel wrong to me." The sincerity in his voice shattered something within me. I looked away, my gaze drawn to the waves rolling in and out, constant and unyielding. "We can't," I started, but the words faltered in my throat. "Why not?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who's going to know? It's just us here." The simplicity of his statement twisted my stomach. He was right, there was no one else around, no one to judge or intervene. Yet, that did not simplify the situation or make it any less forbidden. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice shaky. "I don't know what to say." He shifted closer, his hand brushing against mine. "You don't have to say anything," he whispered. "Just be here with me." I turned to face him, my breath catching at the vulnerability reflected in his expression. He was no longer the confident, carefree teenager I had always known, he was something more. A young boy, my boy, yearned for connection and understanding. In that moment, I experienced a profound ache that felt nearly unbearable. Before I could think twice, I leaned in, closing the gap between us. Our foreheads touched first, a tentative and cautious gesture, followed by his lips brushing against mine. The kiss was gentle, almost undetectable, yet it sent a surge of electricity through me. What was I doing? I should have withdrawn, I should have halted this before it escalated, but I found myself unable to do so. Instead, I leaned into him, my hand rising to caress his cheek. His skin radiated warmth, and his breath was unsteady as he drew closer. The kiss deepened, slow and exploratory, and I felt myself dissolving into him, the burdens of the world fading away. The sound of the waves became distant, and the beach receded into the background as we became enveloped in the moment. His hands rested on my waist, initially tentative but growing more assertive as I did not resist. Each touch, each movement felt like a question, and my response provided the affirmation he sought. His hand resumed its previous path, where he had been applying sunscreen on me, and eventually, we ventured even further, much further. It was surreal, the beach was deserted, allowing us the freedom to act as we wished. And indeed, we did. I had never anticipated this, even with my own son. It was undeniably crazy, yet it felt so good, truly amazing. Despite the absence of others on the beach, I still harbored a fear that someone might overhear us. When he finally finished and we separated, both of us were breathless, the space between us charged with an indescribable energy. He gazed at me, his eyes wide and filled with an emotion I could not name. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to." I shook my head, interrupting him. "Don't apologize," I replied softly. "Just don't." It was incredible. We sat in silence, the weight of what had transpired settling over us like a heavy blanket. I was at a loss for words, struggling to comprehend the tumult of emotions swirling within me. The only certainty I had was that nothing would ever be the same again. As the last rays of daylight faded, the beach was enveloped in darkness. I felt the weight of our choices drawing us into an irreversible situation. The boundary had been crossed, and retreat was no longer an option. The beach, now shrouded in night, was illuminated only by the soft glow of the moon reflecting off the waves. The air had turned cooler, carrying a subtle scent of salt and seaweed, yet I scarcely registered it. My thoughts raced, and my heart continued to pound from the events that had just unfolded. Leo sat beside me, silent and motionless, his hands resting on his knees. His shoulders rose and fell with each deep breath, and I could feel the tension emanating from him. I was at a loss for words, unsure of how to respond. The gravity of the moment loomed between us, heavy and inescapable. "Are you okay?" he finally asked, his voice low and tentative. I nodded slowly, though the reality was far more complex. "I think so," I murmured, my voice barely rising above the gentle sound of the waves. "And you?" He let out a short, almost bitter laugh. "I don't know," he confessed. "I feel like I'm standing on the edge of something, and I can't tell if I should jump or step back." The analogy struck me more profoundly than I anticipated, it perfectly encapsulated my feelings. We had reached a precipice that could alter everything if we chose to leap. The most troubling aspect was my own indecision. Part of me longed to retreat, to reverse what had transpired, while another part, the one that had felt neglected and invisible for so long, yearned to take the plunge. I turned to him, searching his face for some semblance of clarity. His features were obscured in the moonlight, yet I could still discern the worry in his eyes, the uncertainty etched into his expression. "Leo," I began, my voice quivering, "we can't let this go any further. This isn't right." He flinched at my words, his jaw tightening as he averted his gaze. "I know," he replied softly, "but it doesn't feel wrong, not to me." His candor was striking. A blow to the stomach, I had anticipated his agreement, expecting him to acknowledge my feelings and suggest that we could act as if this situation had never occurred. Instead, he laid bare the emotions I had been desperately trying to conceal. "It doesn't matter how it feels," I stated, though the words rang hollow even to my own ears. "We must consider the consequences of what this could mean for us." He turned to face me, his eyes burning with an intensity that left me breathless. "And what about what it has already done?" he challenged. "What about the fact that I cannot stop thinking about you? I feel as though I am losing my mind every time I see you." I stared at him, rendered speechless. His words resonated with my own feelings so precisely that it was almost terrifying. For weeks, I had attempted to push him from my thoughts, convincing myself that my emotions were merely a result of misplaced loneliness. Yet, in this moment, with him gazing at me as if I were the center of his universe, all my justifications crumbled. "Leo," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling, "you are my son." "I know that," he replied fiercely, "but I do not care. I do not care about what others might think or say, all I care about is you." Tears threatened to spill from my eyes as I turned away, gazing out at the ocean in a desperate effort to regain my composure. The waves rolled in and out, steady and unchanging, as if mocking the turmoil within me. I longed to scream, to cry, to do anything to release the tempest of emotions tearing me apart, but instead, I remained silent, my hands clenched into fists in my lap. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch was tentative, almost reluctant, yet it sent a jolt through me nonetheless. I looked down at his hand, so close to mine, and for a fleeting moment, I was tempted to take it, to surrender to the comfort he was offering. But I could not allow this to progress any further. "I cannot do this, Leo," I whispered, withdrawing my hand. "I am sorry, but I cannot." He flinched as if I had struck him, and I despised myself for causing him pain. I perceived the emotions reflected in his eyes, yet I was certain that this was the appropriate course of action. It had to be. He nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging in resignation. "I understand," he said quietly. "I just needed you to know how I feel." "I do know," I replied, my voice quivering. "And I need you to understand that I care about you as well, but not in this way. We cannot be this." The ensuing silence was suffocating. I yearned to reach out and offer him comfort, but I recognized that such an action would only exacerbate the situation. Instead, I stood up, brushing the sand from my legs. "We should go," I stated, my voice barely holding steady. "It's late." He did not contest my words, he simply nodded and began to gather our belongings. The journey back to the car was marked by an oppressive silence, the tension between us nearly unbearable. I could sense his gaze upon me intermittently, yet I refrained from looking back, fearful of what I might discover or feel if our eyes met. Upon reaching the car, I hesitated before entering. I turned to face him, my heart aching at the sight of him standing there, so lost and vulnerable. "I'm sorry," I said softly, tears welling in my eyes. "I truly am." He offered me a faint smile. A forced smile crossed his face as he spoke, though the tremor in his voice revealed the truth behind his words. "I just want you to be happy, Dad. That's all I desire." His statement shattered me, compelling me to avert my gaze, unable to confront the anguish reflected in his eyes. I climbed into the car, my grip on the steering wheel tightening until my knuckles turned pale. As I ignited the engine and drove away from the beach, tears streamed down my face uncontrollably. The journey home was enveloped in silence, the heaviness of our recent experience looming over us like an ominous cloud. Uncertainty about the future weighed heavily on my mind, and I was at a loss regarding how we would navigate the path ahead. All I understood was that our lives would never return to their previous state. My focus remained fixed on the road, my fingers clutching the steering wheel as if it were my sole connection to reality. My thoughts swirled in disarray, too tumultuous to comprehend, and I was unprepared to confront the events that had just transpired. Eventually, he broke the stillness. "Dad," he began, his tone tentative and careful, as if he were gauging my reaction. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to respond. "Yes." "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice barely rising above the car's hum. I stole a fleeting glance at him, my heart aching at the sight of his downcast demeanor. "Leo, it's not your fault," I reassured him, my voice quivering. "It's complicated." He nodded in acknowledgement but remained silent, the chasm of silence widening between us. I yearned to offer more comfort, yet the words eluded me, trapped in my throat. How could I articulate something I struggled to comprehend myself? "I didn't intend for any of this to happen," he confessed after a prolonged pause, his voice wavering. I don't know how to explain it." "I understand," I replied, my grip on the steering wheel tightening further. "Neither can I." He turned to face me, his eyes reflecting a blend of guilt, confusion, and an indescribable depth of emotion. "Do you hate me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question struck me like a blow to the stomach. "Of course not," I responded quickly, my tone resolute despite the tears threatening to overflow. "Leo, I could never harbor hatred towards you, you are my son." He recoiled at the term, his eyes falling to his lap. "I understand that this complicates matters significantly." I found myself unable to dispute his feelings. It was indeed complicated, and the burden of that reality was overwhelming. Yet, a part of me was reluctant to relinquish the past, regardless of its moral implications. That aspect frightened me more than anything else. We continued our journey in silence, the atmosphere thick with tension. Upon arriving at the driveway, I turned off the engine but remained seated, gazing at the darkened windows of the house, my mind racing. "I don't know how to resolve this," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know where to begin." Leo took a moment before responding, his tone quiet yet firm. "Perhaps we cannot resolve it," he suggested. "Maybe we just need to move on." "Move on," I echoed, the words feeling empty as they left my lips. "How do we accomplish that?" He shrugged, his posture reflecting defeat. "I don't know, but we cannot return to the past, not after everything." I nodded in agreement, recognizing the truth in his words. There was no reverting to what had transpired, the only path forward lay ahead, no matter how painful or chaotic it might be. "Let us go inside," I finally said, my voice heavy with fatigue. "We will find a way to navigate this." Leo nodded, and together we exited the car. The cool night air contrasted sharply with the lingering heat in my stomach as we entered the house. The familiar creak of the floorboards beneath us felt unsettling, as if the house itself was aware of the shift that had occurred. Once inside, Leo paused at the base of the stairs, his gaze lingering on me. "Good night, Dad," he said softly, his voice carrying an unspoken question. "Good night," I replied, my voice quivering slightly. I watched him ascend the stairs, his footsteps slow and deliberate, until he vanished into his room. Left alone in the stillness of the house, I finally exhaled the breath I had been holding. I had not realized that I was holding my legs, which felt weak, causing me to sink onto the couch. As I buried my face in my hands, the events of the evening replayed in my mind, a relentless cycle that denied me any peace. What had I done? How had I allowed things to spiral so far out of control? I reflected on Susan and the life we had constructed together, noting the gradual cracks that had formed over the years. The loneliness that had engulfed me, the pain of feeling invisible and unwanted, weighed heavily on my thoughts. I also considered Leo, recalling the way he had looked at me and how he had made me feel alive again, if only for a brief moment. The guilt was overwhelming, a suffocating burden pressing down on my chest. Yet beneath that weight, there was something else, an undeniable feeling I could not dismiss, no matter how hard I tried. A part of me did not regret what had transpired, a part of me had desired it, had needed it in a way I could not fully articulate. I understood that I could not allow it to happen again. I needed to find a way to move forward and rebuild the boundaries that had been shattered. However, as I sat there in the darkness, the magnitude of that task felt insurmountable. For now, all I could do was breathe, one breath at a time, one moment at a time, until I found the strength to confront whatever lay ahead. To this day, I remain uncertain about whether what occurred on the beach was acceptable, and I have not confided in Susan. The connection between Leo and me has obviously changed, and I hope to restore some semblance of normalcy in the future. Yet, I fear that may not be possible. I struggle to comprehend how everything unfolded so suddenly. What are your thoughts on my actions as Leo's father? Please share your opinions in the comments.